Tonight, you're not solving the ocean like it's a puzzle you owe an answer to. You're standing on the edge of a calm Atlantic moment close enough to hear a rigging tick like a tired clock. Close enough to feel how a ship can keep moving even when the human part has quietly vanished. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a sail appear on the horizon, a little too perfect canvas set. Course steady, but no signal flags, no shouted greeting, no movement where movement should live. You'll step onto a deck where the silence feels organized, not ruined ropes in place. Barrels waiting, the ship still wearing its manners. And you'll follow the smallest absences, the missing lifeboat, a tool gone, a choice that suggests someone decided leave now felt safer than stay, and then never got to finish that decision. 3 small senses to keep you company, a lantern glass humming like it's holding its breath, gentle waves tapping the hull as if the sea is practicing courtesy, and the soft tick of rigging repeating as if time itself is still on board. If your breathing wants to borrow that rhythm perfect, inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, consider subscribing only if you enjoy quiet history that doesn't shout, it just drifts closer. And tell me, where and what time are you listening from? I like imagining this ship passing your coastline in the dark, still polite, still moving, still refusing to explain itself. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a storm, or a scream, or a monster in the water. It begins with the calmest horror the ocean can offer, a vessel that won't stop, and a mystery tidy enough to let you fall asleep inside it. Tonight, you're not solving the ocean like it's a puzzle you owe an answer to. You're standing on the edge of a calm Atlantic moment close enough to hear rigging tick like a tired clock. Close enough to feel how a ship can keep moving even when the human part has quietly vanished. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a sail appear on the horizon, a little too perfect canvas set, course steady, but no signal flags, no shouted greeting, no movement where movement should live. You'll step onto a deck where the silence feels organized, not ruined ropes in place. Barrels waiting, the ship still wearing its manners. And you'll follow the smallest absences, the missing lifeboat, a tool gone, a choice that suggests someone decided leave now felt safer than stay, and then never got to finish that decision. 3 small senses to keep you company, a lantern glass humming like it's holding its breath, gentle waves tapping the hull as if the sea is practicing courtesy, and the soft tick of rigging repeating as if time itself is still on board. If your breathing wants to borrow that rhythm perfect, inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, consider subscribing only if you enjoy quiet history that doesn't shout, it just drifts closer. And tell me, where and what time are you listening from? I like imagining this ship passing your coastline in the dark, still polite, still moving, still refusing to explain itself. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a storm, or a scream, or a monster in the water. It begins with the calmest horror the ocean can offer, a vessel that won't stop, and a mystery tidy enough to let you fall asleep inside it. You might not expect an empty ship to be one of the quietest historical documents we have, but it is. Not a diary, not a letter, not even a decent receipt. Just wood, rope, canvas, and an ongoing willingness to drift as if drifting is a profession. The kind of evidence that doesn't argue, doesn't explain itself, and doesn't care whether anyone is impressed. A bit of rigging ticks in the wind, patiently, like a small clock that has forgotten what hour it is supposed to measure. A lantern glass hums with that thin, sleepy vibration glass sometimes makes when air moves around it. Gentle waves tap the hull in a repetitive way, as if the ocean is practicing manners. And somewhere above all of this, there is a sky doing what skies do, being present, being large, being completely unhelpful. The Mary Celeste enters history in a way that is almost rude, because it enters without asking. She is not famous for arriving. She is famous for continuing, for being seen at a distance in the Atlantic light, with sails set in a way that suggests intention, but also a certain casualness, like someone left their coat on but forgot to button it. A brigantine moving as if it has somewhere to be, and the sea, politely, does not interfere. From far away it looks normal, which is always the most suspicious kind of look. Normal is what your brain uses to fall asleep, and then sometimes it notices that normal is not responding to shouting. When the lookout spots her, there's that slow shift from ship to question, because the ship usually answers with small gestures, a flag, a change of course, a bit of fuss on deck, a person becoming a person-shaped dot. And here, there is no waving, no busy movement where busy movement ought to live. Just the steady insistence of forward motion. It's like seeing a carriage roll down a road with no driver, except quieter and wetter, and with more ropes. The sea has a strange talent for offering details one at a time. First the silhouette, then the rigging. Then, if you get close enough, the petty particulars, the way the sails sit, the way the lines hang, the angle of the wheel. It's never a dramatic reveal. It's more like slowly reading the labels on jars in an unfamiliar pantry. You begin with, flower, and end with, why is the flower jar open and where did everyone go? Boarding is not a heroic moment here. It's practical, even slightly awkward. Men step from one deck to another, and the first thing they notice is not terror, but organization. The silence feels arranged, not ruined. Ropes are coiled. Barrels exist in the calm way barrels always exist, as if their life goal is to be cylindrical and dependable. The ship still holds its shape and its manners. It does not look like a place that has fought with the ocean and lost. It looks like a place that was recently being used for work, and then the work simply stopped, like someone paused a song and never pressed play again. There are smaller signals too. Cabins that still look like cabins, not like storm debris. A galley that suggests meals were once a normal routine, not a rare celebration. Bedding that doesn't scream catastrophe, just absence. On an ordinary day, you might think, someone has stepped ashore. But ships are not places you step ashore from casually. Ships are floating commitments. A disciplined crew does not evaporate for a stroll. And then the human layer is missing. No hands, no voices, no warmth trapped in corners. Not even the particular mess that humans leave behind when they are in a hurry, like a half-tied shoelace or an argument mid-sentence. It's the lack of goodbye that makes the air feel slightly too clean. Even when nothing is broken, a missing person is still a missing person, and here is not one missing person. It is everyone. Now the mind begins doing what minds do in quiet rooms. Inventory. Not emotional inventory, not the kind that makes speeches. The boring kind, the soothing kind. Supplies remain. Cargo is not simply stolen. The ship has not been ripped open by some theatrical storm. There is water, there is food. There are personal items that did not have to be left behind, which is important, because people rarely abandon their own property unless they believe they will return soon, or they believe returning won't be an option. Some of the most telling clues are tiny and therefore perfect for bedtime. A tool gone, an item moved. A hatch not quite as it should be. The ship becomes a series of small administrative questions. Was the logbook present? Was it missing? Did someone take certain papers as if paperwork matters, even at sea? Which of course it does, because the ocean is indifferent, but the courts are extremely interested. A maritime mystery is half saltwater and half legal language, and the legal language is usually drier. The galley and cabin suggest interruption rather than destruction, as if something urgent rearranged priorities. It is the difference between a room after a party and a room after someone heard a knock at the door and forgot to close the cupboard. And that difference matters. If you ever want to understand history, you can do worse than studying cupboards that were left open. The past is full of people who meant to come back in 1 minute. There is also the very boring, very important matter of what a ship is for. The Mary Celeste was not out here for romance or symbolism. She was out here because moving goods across water was and remains a business model, not a glamorous one. More like a floating warehouse with a bad view at night. A ship is a schedule made of wood. So when the schedule continues without the humans, you notice? It's like a train arriving on time with no conductor, as if punctuality has become sentient. And then comes the detail that is both simple and strangely loud in its quiet way. The lifeboat is not where it should be. The small boat, the in case of emergency sentence attached to every ship, has left without a farewell. That absence points outward into open water like an arrow drawn by someone who did not stop to consider how large the Atlantic is. If they left, they chose exposure over staying with a functioning vessel. They chose a smaller certainty over a bigger, steadier uncertainty, which tells you that whatever they feared felt immediate, or at least it felt immediate in the moment, which is how most decisions get made, even the historic ones. It is easy from a comfortable chair to imagine that you would never do that. You would stay with the ship, you would be sensible, you would have a plan, but the ocean has a way of making plan feel like a word you said on land. At sea, you sometimes do not choose the best option. You choose the option that feels like doing something. Humans love doing something. It's a small tragedy of our species. We'll press any button just to feel involved. So what could make leave now feel safer than stay? One possibility is not dramatic at all. It is practical and slightly embarrassing, like discovering you left the stove on. Fear can be rational and quiet. It can be a smell, a sound, a small change in the wrong place. Something suggested danger fumes, fire, and explosion risk. A moment where caution becomes escape. There was cargo aboard, and cargo has opinions. Alcohol, for example, is not just a beverage. It is a chemistry project that wants good ventilation. It also wants people to stop carrying lanterns near it as if lanterns are merely decorative. Sometimes a sensible decision becomes fatal simply because distance grows and a rope slips. The small boat might have been tied to the ship. The plan might have been to ride out of fear while remaining connected, like holding someone's sleeve in a crowd. But sleeves can tear, knots can loosen. And the sea doesn't need monsters. Sometimes it only needs one bad calculation and one moment of wind that chooses to be slightly more enthusiastic than expected. Another possibility is that the crew misread the ship's condition in a way that makes perfect sense. People do that constantly. We misread our own phones. We misread the tone of an email. We misread whether the milk is still good, and sometimes we learn the answer the hard way. At sea, the stakes are larger, but the mechanism is the same. A whiff of something odd becomes a narrative. A creak becomes a warning. A puddle becomes proof. Once the brain chooses a story, it is remarkably loyal to it, even when the story is not helpful. There's also the simple, boring fact that ships are loud and quiet in confusing ways. A ship can feel calm while being in danger. It can feel dangerous while being fine. Waves can be gentle while currents are complicated. Weather can be polite while visibility plays tricks. The ocean is a master of mixed signals. It will offer you calm water while also moving you somewhere you did not intend to go, like a moving walkway that leads to the wrong gate. And then there are the theories people reach for because the human mind likes a clean ending. Pirates, mutiny, raiders, something. With footsteps and shouting, something that can be framed like a scene. Violence feels like a conclusion, and conclusions are restful. But the Mary Celeste resists the usual story. Not enough damage, not enough theft, not enough chaos. The evidence stays oddly courteous, as if refusing to perform. It is like walking into a room where you expected a fight and finding that the chairs are all still pushed in. Piracy, when it happens, tends to be rude about it. Pirates generally do not leave valuable cargo behind out of respect for bookkeeping. Mutiny 2 needlessly leaves a mess of intention, someone in charge, someone harmed, some obvious shift in power. Here, the ship seems to have been abandoned, not conquered. A vessel empty, not taken. It is the difference between losing your keys and having your house stolen. One is unsettling because it is small and personal. The other is unsettling because it is dramatic. The Mary Celeste is the keys version, and because the neat stories don't fit, the mind tries softer ones. Could there have been a misunderstanding? A sudden squall that looked like worse than it was? A fear that someone was ill, or that something below decks had become unsafe? Could a captain make a cautious call that, in the wrong minute, becomes the wrong call? The problem with the sea is that you do not get to rewind. There is no let's try that decision again, but with slightly better weather. History is full of people who would have loved that feature. So the theories linger in the gentle way dust lingers in a library. Not dramatic, just present. And the Mary Celeste becomes a kind of floating metaphor for unfinished business, except it's also literally a floating ship, which is more interesting and more boring at the same time. The ocean keeps it upright. The sails settle and tug and relax. The ship continues to behave like a ship, which is, in its own quiet way, the strangest part. Once the vessel is found and towed and claimed, the ocean story moves onto paper and into argument. And the paper, predictably, makes everything less mystical and more exhausting. There are salvage rights. There are hearings. There are suspicions. There are people trying to turn a quiet absence into legal language. The public appetite grows because an empty ship is a perfect container for imagination, and imagination is cheaper than evidence. Newspapers do what newspapers do. They fill space. Courts do what courts do. They ask for details. Everyone becomes interested in the parts that can be counted and proved, even when the most haunting thing is what cannot be counted at all. A found ship is not just a curiosity. It is a financial object. It has value, it has ownership, it has paperwork. Even the ghostly side of the story gets forced into forms and signatures. There is something almost funny about that. A mystery that can to tell you where the crew went can still tell you exactly how humans behave afterward. We argue politely. We accuse quietly. We try to turn uncertainty into a line item. The Mary Celeste becomes less a vessel and more a question that earns new answers because new answers sell well. In a way, the ship keeps sailing, just not on water on conversation. And the conversation never truly ends because it never truly arrives anywhere. Every generation adds a fresh coat of speculation. A new theory, a slightly different emphasis on this detail or that detail. As if the past is a room we keep entering, hoping it will look different if we tilt our heads. But the room is always the same. The ropes are still there. The barrels are still there. The quiet is still organized. The missing people remain missing. In the calm, stubborn way history sometimes keeps its secrets. So picture the last scene softly, not as a climax, just as a continuing state. A lantern swings a little, the way lanterns do when wind can't decide if it is finished. The compass sits steady, pretending it knows what north means in a world that keeps moving. The sea does what it always does. It repeats itself, patiently, with small variations that make it feel alive, without ever making it feel urgent. Hold the idea that the strangest mysteries aren't loud. They're tidy, plausible, and unfinished. They don't shout. They simply fail to answer, and that failure echoes in a gentle way, like footsteps that never quite arrive. In the dark, you can almost imagine the ordinary sounds of a working ship, someone shifting a coil of rope, someone clearing their throat, someone checking a knot out of habit. And then the imagination relaxes because there is no need to solve it right now. The ship has already done the most important thing for sleep. It has offered a question with no deadline. The wind eases. The sails settle into a quieter shape. The rigging ticks, still counting something unimportant. The waves keep tapping, polite and repetitive, and the ocean, with perfect patience, keeps the missing names where it keeps so many things somewhere out there, unclaimed, unhurried, and drifting. It's a strange thing to realize that the loudest part of the Mary Celeste story might be what happens after the ship is already quiet. Not the moment it's found, not the first cautious step onto the deck, but the long, sleepy stretch of human imagination that follows. Because once a vessel refuses to explain itself, the mind begins doing what it always does in the presence of an unanswered question. It starts furnishing the empty room. It brings in a few chairs. It straightens a curtain. It invents footsteps just to make the silence feel less blank. And you can almost understand why. A ship without a crew is not just an inconvenience. It's an insult to the idea that events should make sense. The ocean is already uncooperative, and then it adds a second layer of stubbornness by leaving behind an organized absence. If you're still awake right now, you can subscribe if you feel like it, or don't. Either way, the Mary Celeste will continue not replying to anyone, which is a surprisingly calming form of consistency. One of the gentlest explanations people reach for is the idea of fear that isn't dramatic, just practical. Not the kind of fear that arrives with thunder and a villain, but the kind that arrives with a smell that shouldn't be there. A faint chemical suggestion in the air, a hint of fumes that makes you stop breathing deeply, the way you do when you walk past fresh paint and your brain quietly says, maybe not. On land, you open a window. At sea, you don't always have the luxury of forgetting where your windows are. Cargo has a habit of behaving like a silent roommate. It's in the house with you, it doesn't speak, but it still influences your life. In the 19th century, ships carried things that had very specific preferences: spirits, oils, chemicals, and various substances that become unpleasant when they decide to interact with heat, sparks, or badly sealed containers. Even something as ordinary as alcohol becomes more complicated when it's stored in barrels, and the barrels are stored in a moving wooden box. It's like keeping a pantry inside a trampoline. You can do it, but you will eventually notice that things are not exactly where you left them. So you could imagine a captain noticing a detail and treating it like a warning label, a suspicious leak, a strange pressure in a hold, a barrel that looks fine but doesn't feel fine, as if wood can have moods. And once you start thinking danger, your mind begins assigning danger to everything nearby, like a sleepy security guard seeing suspicious activity in a coat rack. A lantern becomes too bright, a match becomes too confident, a simple routine turns into a risk assessment, and risk assessments, unfortunately, do not help people relax. There is also the possibility of a decision that is sensible in the moment and tragic in hindsight, which describes a large portion of human history and also most group projects. If the crew feared fire or fumes, the lifeboat might have felt like the cleanest, quickest way to create distance. Not forever. Not dramatically. Just a little distance, like stepping back from a campfire when the smoke shifts. Except at sea, a little distance has a way of turning into the rest of your life, because currents are not sentimental and ropes are not immortal. The rope is an especially boring but crucial character in this story. People love to talk about storms and pirates, but a rope quietly failing can do more damage than any shouting. If a small boat was tethered to the ship, the plan could have been cautious and temporary. Drift nearby. Let the danger pass. Reboard when it feels safe. A sensible plan, like putting something in the fridge for later, but later depends on 100 tiny physical facts. The quality of the knot, the condition of the line, the mood of the sea, the moment a wave decides to be just a bit more expressive. And if the rope slips, later becomes never, with no announcement. And then there's the even quieter possibility that what happened was not one big error, but several small ones stacked gently like folded laundry. A misread signal, a wrong assumption, a small panic that still looked orderly. People imagine panic as chaotic, but panic can also be tidy. Panic can be a fast decision made politely. It can be an emergency that still respects routine. You can abandon a ship and still close a door behind you simply because your hands have done that motion 1,000 times. The ocean encouraged this kind of mistake because it is both calm and deceptive. A ship can feel stable while the world underneath it is doing complicated math. The surface can look like a quiet blanket while the current quietly carries you away from your own logic. It is the same way you can feel calm scrolling your phone and then suddenly realize you've been awake for an hour longer than you planned. Nothing dramatic happened. Time just moved. But of course, the mind reaches for more theatrical explanations because theater has the decency to provide an ending. Pirates are popular for this reason. Pirates arrive with a clear storyline, like a loud neighbor who explains himself by existing. If pirates attacked, then the crew is gone because someone took them. Simple, understandable, almost comforting in a grim way because at least it has a shape. The trouble is, pirate-shaped stories usually leave pirate-shaped evidence. A ship that has been robbed often looks like it has been treated rudely. Things missing, things broken, signs of struggle. A general sense that someone entered the space with intention and patience. The Mary Celeste, in contrast, looks like a ship that lost its humans without losing its manners. Not enough chaos. Not enough theft. Not enough drama. It's as if the evidence itself is refusing to be entertaining. Mutiny has the same problem. Mutiny is also a very tidy narrative. There's conflict. There's a shift in power. There's usually a visible consequence because people in power struggles are rarely subtle. Yet the Mary Celeste offers no clean stage for that. No obvious violence, no clear replacement crew, no satisfying scene where you can point and say, ah yes, here is the part where everything changed. This is why the theories linger. They can't quite attach themselves to the wood. They hover around the story like fog that keeps returning because the conditions are right. And the conditions are always right for lingering when the facts are sparse. The mind keeps circling the same details. A missing lifeboat, a vessel still afloat, cargo still present, daily life interrupted without the courtesy of a note. Even a simple household mystery like finding your keys in the refrigerator can keep you awake. Now, imagine that mystery is happening in the Atlantic. Some explanations are almost tender in their smallness. A sudden weather shift that looked worse than it was. A squall, a frightening swell. A moment when the ship seemed to behave oddly, as if it had become untrustworthy. Seafaring is full of moments like that, where the sea persuades you that it is about to change its mind. And sailors, being practical people, sometimes respond to persuasion quickly. The ocean does not reward hesitation, but it also does not reward haste. It rewards nothing in particular, which is one of its more exhausting traits. It's also worth remembering how information travels on a ship, not with certainty, but with interpretation. A sound in the hold becomes a rumor, a smell becomes a warning. One person's concern becomes everyone's concern, because at sea, it's easier to share fear than to verify it. Verification requires calm, time, and good lighting. The Mary Celeste story is full of shadows, and shadows are famous for encouraging guesses. And once guesses exist, they become sticky, because a guess is a kind of relief. It's the mind's way of saying, at least we have something to hold. Even if the thing you're holding is wrong, it still feels better than holding nothing at all. Nothing is slippery, nothing is cold, nothing drifts. So the ship becomes a steady engine for speculation, and speculation becomes a second voyage. Not across water, but across newspapers, dinner tables, and late-night conversations. And that, in a strange way, is where the Mary Celeste becomes most human. Not because she gains people back, but because people attach themselves to her absence like ivy climbing a wall. The ship doesn't speak, so everyone speaks around it. Eventually, the story washes up on shore in the form of paperwork, which is how many sea tailies end when they want to be taken seriously. Salvage claims, hearings, testimony, a careful attempt to translate a floating mystery into a sequence of legal questions. And the legal questions are wonderfully, sleepily specific. Who found the ship? When? In what condition? What was missing? What was present? What was disturbed? What was untouched? Courts love details in the way bedtime loves repetition. The only difference is that bedtime uses repetition to relax you, and courts use repetition to exhaust you into honesty. Salvage law, by the way, is one of those topics that feels like it was invented specifically to make people yawn, which is a compliment in this context. The basic idea is that saving property at sea can earn you a reward, because otherwise people might look at a drifting vessel and think, that seems like work, and then continue their day. So society created a system: rescue the thing, prove the rescue, and you may be compensated. It is like finding someone's lost wallet and being allowed to keep a polite finder's fee, except the wallet weighs several hundred tons and refuses to explain why it was alone. But salvage also invites suspicion, because if you get paid for finding an empty ship, the world will eventually ask if you had any involvement in the emptiness. Humans are like that. We see a benefit and immediately wonder who engineered it. It's a very modern instinct, really. The 19th century just did it with more paper and less internet. So the Mary Celeste is brought into a courtroom, not physically, but conceptually. She becomes a set of descriptions. She becomes testimony about a hatch, a rope, a boat, a logbook, a compass, a barrel, a cabin. Every detail is asked to sit up straight and answer questions, even though details have no mouths. People try to make the silence confess, and silence, being very good at its job, continues doing nothing at all. Meanwhile, newspapers pick up the story because an empty ship is irresistible. It's the perfect blend of realism and imagination. It has a real name, a real route, real cargo, real dates. And then it has a blank space where humans should be, and blank spaces are extremely profitable. A blank space can hold any theory. It can hold pirates, sea monsters, insurance fraud, secret violence, or tragic error. It can hold anything because it holds nothing. The public appetite grows in a predictable pattern. First curiosity, then confidence, then embellishment. People begin describing the ship as if it were designed to be eerie, even though it was designed to be functional. A brigantine is not a haunted mansion. It is a working vehicle, but give any working vehicle a missing crew, and it becomes a stage. It becomes a symbol. It becomes whatever the audience needs it to be, which is exactly what happens to historical events once they enter popular memory. And popular memory is not a librarian. It does not file things neatly. It does not separate fact from flourish with careful hands. Popular memory is more like a person half asleep, mixing dreams with yesterday's conversation. It keeps the parts that feel vivid. It forgets the parts that feel technical. It prefers a dramatic shadow to a boring rope. And the Mary Celeste, unfortunately for the truth and fortunately for bedtime, offers both. The ship herself becomes less a vessel and more a question that keeps earning new answers. New answers appear in books and articles and quiet debates. Someone will always say, "Actually, I read that," and then the sentence will drift into an explanation that may or may not be true, but will almost always be delivered with the confidence of someone describing their own kitchen. And that's how mysteries live. They live by being retold. They live by refusing to settle. In a strange way, that makes the Mary Celeste feel alive. Not alive as in haunted, but alive as in still working. Still doing her job, which now is not carrying cargo, but carrying attention. Carrying the soft weight of uncertainty from one century to the next. A ship that would not stop, not just on the Atlantic, but in the mind. And perhaps that is the calmest part of the story to hold at bedtime, The idea that some historical questions do not need to be solved to be useful. They can be held lightly, they can be repeated, they can be allowed to drift. The urge to resolve everything is not mandatory. The Mary Celeste is proof. She offers no conclusion, and yet she continues to occupy a quiet corner of human thought, like a candle that burns without warming anything in particular. So imagine the afterlife of this mystery as a gentle, ongoing scene rather than an ending. The ship, once towed, becomes a file, a headline, a rumor, a footnote, a late-night topic. People argue, people write, people point to maps and insist that their theory fits the currents better than someone else's theory, which is the historical equivalent of arguing about whose directions are more efficient when everyone is already lost. And somewhere beneath all of that talk, the original quiet remains. The rigging still ticks in your imagination. The lantern glass still hums. The waves still tap the hull as if practicing the same sentence over and over. The ship stays tidy, plausible, unfinished. It does not demand your energy. It does not require your fear. It simply exists as a calm reminder that the world contains blanks, and the blanks do not collapse the world. They just float. Picture the last moment softly, not a big reveal, not a final statement, just the kind of scene you can let fade. A deck at night, a mast standing patiently against the sky. A compass that keeps pointing, dutifully, even when the humans who relied on it are gone. The wind eases, because wind often does, eventually. The sea keeps doing what it always does, which is to continue. And in the dark, you can almost hear the smallest sounds, wood shifting, rope settling, fabric breathing. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Just the quiet machinery of a ship that, for a little while, carried only questions, and then carried them onward into paper, into talk, into time, and into the gentle, drowsy habit of wondering without needing an answer. You might not expect the sleep-iced corner of medieval history to be a monk staring at a laundry list, trying to remember whether the last 2 towels were for guests or for God, but here we are. Somewhere in a stone building that smells faintly of wax and damp wool, a small administrative moment is unfolding. Not a battle, not a coronation, not even a particularly impressive prayer. Just the quiet problem of fabric existing in a world that insists on rules. Imagine a door creaking softly in a hallway that echoes too much, a candle giving up little shivers of light, and the gentle, steady sound of water somewhere outside. And very quietly, just for a second, consider this. Where and what time are you listening from? Monastic life is often described as simple, which is a charming word that mostly means complicated in a different direction. The goal, at least on paper, is to reduce distractions. Fewer possessions, fewer choices, fewer dramatic hobbies like sword collecting. But even a community that owns very little still owns something. And the moment you own something in a group, you need a system. A system in a monastery tends to arrive wearing sandals and carrying a ledger. Someone has to know how many tunics exist. Someone has to know how many sheets are clean. Someone has to know why the good blanket has migrated again, as if it has personal ambitions. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or don't, it's fine. The medieval monks will continue doing what they did best, which was repeating the same small tasks with impressive seriousness. The laundry will still need washing, the ink will still need drying, and somewhere a person will still be quietly disappointed that the wool is pilling. A monastery is not just a spiritual space. It is also a small machine that eats food and produces chanting. It has schedules, it has storage rooms. It has people assigned to jobs with names that sound gentle until you realize they were basically department heads. In many communities, the cellarer was responsible for supplies, which is a polite way of saying they had to care about everything that could run out. Grain, oil, salt, candles, and yes, cloth. Someone had to know what was in the cupboards, and someone had to decide what happened when the cupboards were not cooperating. Clothing in a monastic setting is supposed to be modest and functional, but functional still involves things like warmth, dryness, and not being publicly embarrassed by holes. Many orders had rules about what could be worn and when, and those rules lived in the same space as reality. Reality, for example, includes winters. Reality includes mud. Reality includes the fact that wool can smell like a thoughtful sheep if you don't handle it correctly. So even if the ideal monk owns only a small set of garments, those garments still need care, repair, and occasional replacement, which means the monastery needs a quiet supply chain. Nothing very heroic. Just a constant stream of cloth trying to survive. Laundry itself is not a single action. It's a whole gentle ecosystem of repetitive decisions. Water has to be carried or approached. Soap or soap-like substances have to be made or acquired. Ashes can become lye. Fat can become something closer to soap if someone is patient enough, and medieval patience was sometimes forced by the complete absence of convenience stores. There's also the simple, stubborn matter of scrubbing, which is the least glamorous form of devotion imaginable. You can chant while you scrub, but it doesn't make the scrubbing more interesting. It just gives the scrubbing a soundtrack. Some monasteries had dedicated wash areas, sometimes near rivers or streams, because water is the main ingredient in both cleanliness and mild misery. You can picture a few figures working quietly, sleeves rolled, hands red from cold, doing the same motion over and over. Dip, rub, wring, repeat. The kind of motion that turns thoughts into fog. In a way, it's almost modern. If you've ever stood in front of a washing machine waiting for it to finish, you understand the spiritual experience of being held hostage by fabric. And then, when the washing is done, there's drying. Drying is the part that makes everything feel like a negotiation with the weather. Lines are set up, cloth is hung. Wind is either helpful or smug. If the air is damp, the cloth stays damp, and damp cloth has a talent for becoming a personality. It starts making opinions known. It starts smelling like it has secrets. So people learn to time laundry with seasons, sunlight, and whatever small stretches of predictable weather they could find. Not dramatic, just practical. A monastery, for all its heavenly orientation, still lives under the same sky as everyone else. The truly sleepy detail is that laundry becomes record keeping. Because once cloth is washed, it must be returned, and returning things in a community requires a memory. Human memory is unreliable, especially when everyone looks more or less the same, and everyone owns more or less the same items. So monasteries developed ways of tracking, inventories, lists, notes, sometimes marks on garments, sometimes careful distribution routines. The point wasn't personal fashion. The point was order. An order in a monastery is basically a form of prayer that happens with paper. This is where the absurdity gets soft and delightful. You might imagine medieval monks as people who avoided worldly complications, but you can't fully avoid complications when you live with 30 other humans who all need socks. Even if the socks are humble, especially if the socks are humble, because humble socks have a shorter lifespan and a higher rate of disappearance. A sock is a small object with a big talent for being misplaced. It doesn't even need pockets. It can simply vanish through the ancient magic of someone picked it up and forgot, so the lists appear. They might describe how many tunics are in circulation, how many belts, how many cloaks for colder days, how many linens for the infirmary, how many spare blankets for guests. Some records were startlingly specific, not because anyone loves specificity, but because specificity prevents arguments. If you write down 2 sheets, 1 patched, you reduce the chance that someone later claims there were 3 sheets and all of them were better. The medieval mind understood something we pretend not to understand today. If you don't write it down, it will become a discussion, and discussions are exhausting. It's also important to remember that monasteries often included more than one kind of resident. There might be choir monks focused on liturgy, and lay brothers doing more manual work, depending on time, place, and order. The work still needed coordinating, and cloth moved through those categories like a quiet currency. Aprons, work garments, towels for kitchens, cloths for cleaning, linens for altars. Yes, even holiness has laundry. The altar might be draped in clean cloth, and if it wasn't clean, someone noticed. Someone always notices a stained cloth in a place meant to feel orderly. It's like a smudge on a phone screen. Once you see it, it becomes the main character. There were also rules about repairs, which is a beautifully boring subject. Instead of discarding worn cloth, people patched it. They restitched seams. They turned old garments into new uses because cloth was valuable and time was long. A tunic might become rags. Rags might become cleaning cloths. Cleaning cloths might become nothing, eventually, and then they might become kindling. This is the slow, circular economy of medieval fabric, and it's almost soothing. Everything fades gently into something else. Nothing is wasted loudly. It just becomes less itself over time. If you're listening to this while wearing something soft, you're participating in a long tradition of humans trying to make fabric behave. The difference is that modern clothing disappears into a machine with buttons, while medieval clothing disappeared into a process with wrists and patience. But the emotional experience is similar, the mild disappointment when something shrinks, the suspicion that the washing has rearranged reality, the quiet moment when you realize the good item is missing again, and you start questioning whether it ever existed. Some monasteries, especially wealthy ones, could acquire better textiles. Some had access to linen, which feels nicer but still demands effort. Linen wrinkles with confidence, as if it's proud of being difficult. Wool is warm, but it holds on to water and odors like it's collecting memories. Each material has its own temperament, and the people dealing with them had to learn those temperaments the way you learn the moods of a pet. When is the fabric agreeable? When does it become stubborn? What happens if you dry it poorly? What happens if you store it damp? The answers were not philosophical, but they were learned through repetition, which is a very monastic way of knowing. Now imagine the storage rooms, chests, shelves, bundles of cloth folded with varying degrees of hope. The cellarer or another official might inspect supplies, not because they enjoyed inspection, but because inspection prevents surprise. Surprise is the enemy of routine. Routine is the friend of sleep. So the monastery invests in routine the way a modern person invests in a calendar app, except the calendar app is a person with a quill and a tired face. There's a particular kind of medieval humor hidden in all this. It's not loud humor. It is the quiet irony of a life devoted to transcending earthly concerns while constantly negotiating earthly concerns. You can renounce worldly possessions, but you cannot renounce the existence of mud. Mud does not respect vows. Mud respects gravity. And gravity, as history has shown us, is undefeated. Sometimes the records themselves become almost poetic, not intentionally, but because lists can sound like spells when they're repetitive. 2 tunics, 3 belts, 1 cloak in need of mending, linen cloths for the infirm, towels for the kitchen, racks for the workshop. There's a rhythm to it like counting sheep, except you're counting textiles. And textiles, unlike sheep, do not wander, unless you consider the mysterious way a towel can end up in the wrong room. We can also drift for a moment into the quiet economics behind it. Cloth is labor, cloth is trade. Cloth is plants turned into thread, thread turned into fabric, fabric turned into daily comfort. If a monastery produced cloth, that meant someone was spinning, weaving, and maintaining tools. If it bought cloth, that meant money, relationships, and negotiations with merchants. Even the most isolated communities were not fully sealed. They were part of a world where goods moved slowly and decisions had consequences. A shortage of cloth didn't cause an epic war, but it caused discomfort, which in some contexts is more persuasive than war. People will tolerate many things, but they become noticeably less spiritual when their bedding is damp. And because monasteries had guests, pilgrims, travelers, officials, there was always the quiet pressure of appearing orderly. Hospitality required supplies. It required clean linens, or at least linens that looked like they had been introduced to water at some point. The guest house might have its own stash of bedding, carefully managed like a small treasure. Not treasure in the gold sense, but treasure in the please don't embarrass us sense. Clean cloth is a form of reputation. Even today, you can judge a place by its towels. Medieval people could too. They just had fewer options for complaining online. At this point, the story doesn't need to become dramatic, and it won't. It just continues the way laundry continues. Cloth comes in, cloth gets used, cloth gets dirty, cloth gets washed, cloth gets recorded, cloth gets lost, someone sighs, someone patches, someone writes another line in a ledger. The monastery remains calm, not because nothing happens, but because everything happens in the same gentle loop. And the loop itself becomes the most interesting part in the sleepless way. The monks weren't trying to solve a mystery. They weren't trying to chase excitement. They were trying to keep a community functioning without noise. A laundry list, in that sense, is a small victory, proof that human needs can be managed quietly. It's a tiny piece of administrative peace. So if you let your mind drift, imagine the end of a day. The chanting has softened to silence. The corridors hold their cool air. The workrooms settle. Somewhere a folded cloth sits in a chest, smelling faintly of ash and sun. Someone has written down what exists, not because the universe demanded it, but because tomorrow will arrive and want the same things. A clean towel, a mended sleeve, a blanket that feels familiar. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just the slow comfort of small order. And as the candle flame leans a little and the ink dries without being asked, the monastery keeps doing what it always does, repeating the gentle tasks that make life livable, one quiet detail at a time, as if history itself is just a long, soft ledger entry that never quite ends, only fades into the next line, and the next, and then another, until your thoughts feel folded too, and the night becomes as simple as fabric finally lying still. You might not expect a ship to be at its most unsettling when it is doing everything correctly, but quietly, politely, almost beautifully, and with absolutely no one inside it. A vessel can look perfectly alive from far away, canvas holding wind, hull sitting level, rigging making it small, tidy noises while also behaving like a person who has left the room and forgotten to turn off the lights. And that is the Mary Celeste, drifting in the Atlantic in 1872, offering the world a kind of administrative mystery. Not a roaring Gothic one, more like a filing cabinet that won't open, even though the key is right there and you are fairly sure you are holding it the correct way. Before we begin floating too far, let me ask softly, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Because this is a story that doesn't really hurry. It mostly drifts. It drifts the way a ship drifts when the wind is gentle and the ocean is being polite. And if you can picture a lantern glass humming faintly with the ship's movement and hear the rigging ticking like a slow clock, you are already in the right place. There is a particular kind of quiet in the open sea that makes ordinary things feel more significant than they deserve. A sail on the horizon is not just canvas. It becomes a question. A ship not answering signals becomes a small insult to the social contract of sailors, who are very fond of rules and routines. In the 19th century Atlantic, a passing vessel would typically show some sign of life. A flag, a wave, a shift in course, a little human noise carried across the water. You weren't supposed to just glide along like a thought that never finishes forming. So when another ship, often described in accounts as the Dei Gratia, noticed the Mary Celeste moving strangely, the first feeling wasn't cinematic terror, It was professional curiosity. The sort of curiosity a person gets when they notice a neighbor's front door wide open at noon. It could be nothing, but it is also exactly the kind of nothing that turns into paperwork later. From a distance, the Mary Celeste looked oddly competent. Not racked, not shattered, not sinking in a dramatic spiral. Her sails were set, though not perfectly, and that detail matters because the sea is full of messy endings. A ship in trouble usually advertises it. A ship that doesn't advertise anything is, in its own way, being rude. The ocean offers one detail at a time, like someone telling a story and pausing after every sentence to sip tea. When the boarding party finally approached, they stepped into a scene that was not loud. It was organized, as if the ship had been paused. The deck was there. The ropes were there. The barrels and fittings were there. The wood had that familiar salt-darkened look of a working vessel. This is one of the strangest parts. An empty ship is still full of things. And the things stay behind like quiet witnesses who dawn to know they re-participating in history. Walking across a deck like that is probably less like entering a haunted house and more like entering a workplace after hours. Everything is normal, except the normalness is missing its people. The galley is still a galley. The cabins are still cabins. The rails still hold the sea away in the same dependable manner. And yet the human layer is absent, no footsteps answering yours, no voices, no warm mess in the corners. Even the silence feels deliberate, like a rule being followed. Small details become more important when there is no one around to explain them. A chair in the wrong place becomes a headline. A cup left out becomes a thesis. And sailors, being practical people trapped in a romantic profession, are excellent at noticing what is missing. They notice the obvious things first, like the lifeboat. A lifeboat is not a decorative accessory. It is a plan. And if the plan is gone, it means someone used it, which means someone decided the ship was less safe than the open water. That is a choice that feels backwards, which is why it stays in the mind like a pebble you can to quite shake out of your shoe. But the missing lifeboat is only the first absence. There are also those gentle, irritating half-absences, supplies still present, cargo not simply stolen, the ship not torn open by a storm like a can. The Mary Celeste's condition, depending on which account you read, suggests interruption rather than destruction. It has the vibe of an errand that didn't get finished, like someone left in the middle of making bread and never came back to check the oven. You can picture the galley, the small space where food becomes morale. Maybe there are utensils, maybe there's a pot, maybe there are crumbs that have no future. Food aboard ships often followed strict routines. Salted meat, hardtack, beans, whatever could survive time and dampness. If supplies remain, it hints that this wasn't a scenario where everyone slowly starved and then agreed to leave in a dignified line. It suggests something quicker, something that made leave now feel smarter than stay. The cargo is another sleepy detail, because cargo is boring, and boredom is often where truth hides. The Mary Celeste carried commercial goods famously. In many retellings, barrels of alcohol, industrial spirits, things meant for profit, not romance. Barrels are not glamorous. Barrels are round commitments. They roll, they leak, they smell, and they require constant attention. If some barrels were found leaking, or if fumes were suspected, it introduces the kind of fear that isn't dramatic, but is rational. The fear of invisible danger. The fear of the air being wrong. That kind of fear feels almost modern. You know how you can be in a room and suddenly wonder if something is burning, even though you can't see fire? And then your brain starts inventing hazards at a responsible pace, not screaming, just listing. Gas leak, electrical short, something chemical. Something you can't argue with using bravery. Sailors were not strangers to invisible dangers. They understood that you can't punch bad air. And yet, the ship itself was still floating. Still functional. Still, in many descriptions, capable of being sailed if someone simply took the wheel and began being a person again. That is what makes the scene so tidy and unsettling. The ship feels like a sentence that ends too early, leaving you to guess the missing word. It's not a cliffhanger. It's more like a receipt with the total torn off. Now, because humans are humans, the mind begins offering theories, the way a sleepy person begins offering excuses to stay awake. Theories are comforting because they make the unknown feel shaped. And the sea, which is excellent at unshaping things, invites shaping. You start with the gentle explanations: bad weather, a misjudged danger, a brief panic that became permanent once distance grew and a rope slipped and a small boat became a very small island. A crew can make a sensible decision in a moment that becomes fatal later, simply because the ocean has a talent for turning temporary into forever. Imagine a captain smelling fumes and thinking calmly that everyone should go into the lifeboat for a little while, just for safety, just until the air feels less suspicious. They might even tether the lifeboat to the ship, planning to climb back aboard when things settle. This is not a dramatic plan. It's the kind of plan you make when you think you're being responsible, and responsibility, unfortunately, is not always rewarded. A tether can snap, a line can slip, wind can change its mind. The sea doesn't need monsters. Sometimes it only needs one bad knot and a moment of distraction. A ship drifts faster than you expect. A lifeboat drifts slower than you want. The distance grows with that quiet inevitability you can almost feel in your chest. And then, without any dramatic villain, the crew becomes separated from the safest object they had. The Mary Celeste continues on, still doing her job, still holding her shape and manners, while the people who belonged inside her become smaller on the water until they are just another detail the ocean keeps. But then the mind tries the louder theories, because louder theories feel like endings. Piracy, mutiny, violence, they have a neatness to them. They provide a reason you can point at, yet the ship's condition resists the usual story. Not enough damage, not enough theft, not enough chaos. Pirates, in popular imagination, are energetic. They leave mess. They take valuables. They do not usually abandon a perfectly good ship after politely removing only the crew and leaving the cargo behind like an apology. Mutiny, too, tends to have a texture, tension, conflict, changes in control, signs that humans argued. And while arguments can happen without leaving stains, the overall calmness of the Mary Celeste makes the dramatic options feel slightly mismatched, like wearing a heavy coat in warm weather. Possible, but uncomfortable. This is where the mystery becomes sleep-friendly because it refuses to perform. It just sits there. Evidence stays polite. It doesn't commit to a single narrative. It's like a person who keeps answering questions with maybe, and then smiling gently, and then going back to staring out the window. Meanwhile, the practical world does what it always does. It turns a strange event into legal language. Because a drifting ship is not only a curiosity, it is property. And property, in the 19th century, is a powerful kind of reality. Salvage law existed so that people who rescued ships could be rewarded, which encourages rescue and discourages the sea from owning everything by default. So once the Mary Celeste was found and brought in, the story moved onto paper. Courts got involved, testimony appeared. People argued about motives, rights, and credibility. A mystery becomes less ghostly and more bureaucratic the moment it enters a courtroom. It's a wonderful deflation. The ocean produces wonder, and the land produces forms to fill out. And in the background of all of this, newspapers begin doing what newspapers love, expanding a mystery into a portable object. The public appetite grows because an empty ship is a perfect container for imagination. It can be filled with whatever you like, and no one can fully stop you. It's like a blank notebook that keeps insisting it has secrets. Some writers embroidered the story. Some simplified it. Some turned it into a parable about fate or doom or the sea's appetite. But the most persistent version, the one that keeps the Mary Celeste sleepily fascinating, is the version where the truth is probably small, not glamorous, not theatrical. Just a chain of ordinary decisions, a worry about fumes, a concern about weather, a routine action that becomes irreversible because the sea is better at consequences than humans are. There's something almost comforting in that, if you squint gently. Not comforting in a cheerful way, comforting in the way routine is comforting. The Mary Celeste may have been abandoned not because of supernatural force, but because humans in a moment tried to be cautious. They chose the lifeboat as a temporary precaution, and the ocean treated temporary as a suggestion rather than a contract. If you ever want to feel a little more sympathetic to 19th century sailors, consider how often modern people evacuate buildings because of a fire alarm that turns out to be burnt toast. We leave because leaving is safer than staying, and because we trust that we can return. The Mary Celeste is the story of not returning, not because the building exploded, but because the door closed behind you and the hallway changed shape. And now, let's drift to the quiet afterlife of the mystery, which is where the Mary Celeste becomes less a vessel and more a question that keeps earning new answers. Ships like this become symbols. They get retold. They get referenced. They become shorthand for unexplained. People use them the way people use old phrases, until the original event is partially buried under the weight of repetition. In reality, the ship had a history before the mystery and a history after it, and that is a detail that feels very human. We want mysteries to end at the most dramatic moment, but actual objects keep existing. They get repaired. They get sold. They get renamed. They keep being wood and rope and labor. Even a famous ship still has to deal with boring things like maintenance. So you can picture, if you like, the Mary Celeste not as a ghostly legend, but as a tired work vehicle that accidentally became famous. A ship that did not ask for myth. A ship that merely drifted and then got pulled into courtrooms and headlines and endless retellings. The business of wonder is still business, and business loves a repeatable product. And then, at the very end, we return to the deck itself, because the deck is where the story feels calmest. Imagine the last scene is soft, a lantern swinging slightly, a compass steady, doing its patient job. The ocean doing what it always does, which is moving without comment. The rigging makes its small ticking sound in the wind, like an old clock that refuses to stop. Hold the idea that the scariest mysteries aren't loud. They are tidy, plausible, and unfinished. They are the kind that don't shout. They simply continue not answering. In the dark, you can almost hear footsteps that never return, not as a haunting, but as memory. Quiet impression left behind by ordinary people who once did ordinary tasks on a ship that happened to become extraordinary because it was found alone. The wind eases, the sails settle. The sea keeps its rhythm, endlessly repeating its gentle and different motions. And somewhere in that repetition, the missing names remain missing, not as a dramatic cliffhanger, but as a soft blank space, like an unfilled line in a logbook that the ocean never hands back, and never explains, and never seems to feel the need to finish. You might not expect the National Monument to spend a good portion of its life quietly worrying about rust, but it does. Not dramatically, not with speeches, just with the patient, reddish-brown determination that iron has, the way bread has a determination to go stale if you look away for a day. And if you're picturing the Eiffel Tower as a single heroic moment frozen in metal, it may help to picture it instead as a very tall, very famous maintenance schedule that happens to have a view. Before we climb into anything, very slowly and with no urgency, let me ask in a whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Because the topic tonight is not a battle or a romance or a mystery that resolves. It is the gentle bureaucracy of keeping a giant iron structure from quietly turning back into a kind of orange powder, one careful brushstroke at a time. The Eiffel Tower, as you probably know in the vague way one knows a famous object, opened in 1889 for the Exposition Universelle in Paris. It was built fast, it was built tall, and it was built out of puddled iron, which is sturdy and also, unfortunately, extremely interested in oxidizing if you give it air and moisture and a few decades of opportunity. Iron is like that friend who is perfectly fine as long as you keep an eye on them, and then you blink and they've wandered off into trouble. There is a pleasingly boring fact about famous structures. They do not remain famous by simply existing. They remain famous by being constantly looked after by people whose names do not make it into postcards. The Eiffel Tower is not just a tower. It's a job. It's a small army of inspections, rivets, staircases, elevators, and paint. And the unglamorous truth that the tower's look is, in part, the look of paint. Paint is one of the quietest forms of protection humans have invented. It's not loud. It doesn't sparkle. It doesn't defeat enemies. It simply sits there between metal and air, politely saying, "No, not today," to oxygen. And when paint fails, it does not fail with a bang. It fails with little blisters, flakes, and a faint sense of disappointment. If you're still awake by the time I start describing how many tons of paint a very tall tower might require, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The tower will still need paint either way, and my feelings will remain safely uninjured in the dark. One of the first things to accept, if we are going to drift comfortably through this, is that the Eiffel Tower has had multiple colors. People imagine it as a fixed shade, like it was born that way. But early on, it was painted in different tones, sometimes described as reddish-brown, sometimes leaning toward a kind of ochre, and at various points it had gradients, with darker paint at the base and lighter paint toward the top. Which is a charming idea because it means the tower once participated in a kind of giant, subtle ombre trend long before social media discovered ombre and began using it on hair, molds, and cupcakes. The reason for a gradient is partly aesthetic and partly practical. Darker at the base can make the structure feel grounded. Lighter at the top can soften it against the sky. And there's something soothing about a monument being treated like an object someone is styling. Like Paris looked at the world's tallest tower at the time and thought, yes, but what if we blended it a little better? And then there is the basic, persistent problem. The tower is made of iron, and iron wants to rust. Rust is not a malicious force, it is a chemical preference. The tower exists in a city with weather. Weather does not care about national pride. Rain lands where it lands, moisture creeps into corners. Wind carries grit. Sun warms surfaces and cools them again. Everything expands, contracts, and slightly shifts, as if the tower is breathing in slow motion. So the tower is inspected. Not once, not occasionally. The way a careful person checks a roof every year, the tower is checked because the alternative is letting time do its hobby. Inspectors look for corrosion, for paint failure, for places where water might pool. They look at rivets because rivets are the tower's quiet punctuation marks. The Eiffel Tower is essentially a sentence written in iron, and rivets are its commas. There are a lot of them, and each rivet represents a moment where someone in the 1880s decided to connect two pieces of metal permanently, and then trusted future generations to keep that decision from becoming a slow, creaky regret. When it comes to painting the tower, the numbers become gently absurd. Not absurd like a joke, absurd like a tax form. The surface area is enormous. Painting it requires scaffolding, safety gear, and workers who spend their days in the wind, leaning into metal lattice, carefully applying layers. The paint is not slapped on in a rush, because a rush paint job is basically an invitation to rust. And rust accepts invitations. Historically, the tower has been repainted in full on a cycle, often mentioned as roughly every 7 years, though real life is always a little messier than a tidy number. The idea is simple. Paint is a protective coat. Protective coats wear out. So you replace them before the coat becomes a suggestion instead of a barrier. The tower is like a very large, very public piece of furniture that needs refinishing, except the furniture is 300 meters tall and is constantly being photographed. Imagine the process. First, you have to remove or prepare old paint where it's failing. That can involve scraping, cleaning, sanding. The tower does not present itself as a smooth wall. It presents itself as a lattice of angles and crossbeams, which means there are corners, overlaps, crevices, places where dirt can sit and water can linger. There are also places where someone painted before and that paint has lived a full life and now it's tired. Then you apply primer and then layers of paint. Paint layers are not just color, they are defense. And each layer must adhere properly. If it doesn't, it will peel, and peeling is like the tower sighing and saying, well, we tried. There is also the question of what kind of paint to use, because not all paints are the same, and the tower does not want to be treated like a garden fence. There are paints designed for metal. There are paints designed to resist weather. There are considerations about durability, toxicity, drying time, and how the paint behaves when the sun heats the structure during the day and the air cools it at night. The tower is basically a giant experiment in the reality that materials live in conditions, not theories. And then there is the small comedic reality of being a painter on the Eiffel Tower. You are painting something people will judge from far away while you are standing so close to it that it mostly looks like metal in the immediate future. From the painter's perspective, the tower is not a symbol. It is a series of surfaces that need coverage. It is a collection of angles that keep repeating. It is a very polite kind of endless. Somewhere down below, tourists buy small tower-shaped keychains. Somewhere up above, a worker is carefully coating a beam, thinking about wind. The contrast is almost tender. One person is collecting the idea of the Eiffel Tower. Another is maintaining the reality of it. When the tower is repainted, it's not as if Paris shuts down and everyone watches the paint dry. Work happens in sections, visitors still come. Elevators still run because the tower is a monument and also a business, and businesses prefer not to close if they can avoid it. That means the painting operation must coexist with the tower's daily life, which is a wonderfully dull form of drama, scheduling. And scheduling is where history becomes sleepy, because behind every famous object, there is a calendar. There are permits, there are budgets, there are procurement decisions. Someone has to order paint. Someone has to decide how much. Someone has to sign something that confirms, in official language, that the Eiffel Tower will continue to be brownish and not, for example, mint green. It is oddly calming to remember that monument colors are choices. The Eiffel Tower's familiar shade today is often referred to as Eiffel Tower Brown, which sounds like a brand of chocolate, and also like a color invented specifically so the tower can look like itself. It's a color designed to be flattering and Parisian white, a color designed to be serious but not gloomy, a color designed to hide a little dirt because towers, like children, are not always clean. And then there are the micro hooks, the tiny strange facts that keep the mind gently engaged. For instance, repainting a structure like that means dealing with gravity in a way you usually don't have to think about. Paint drips, paint falls, tools fall if you're careless. Everything is tethered. Everything is clipped. Even a brush becomes an object with a safety plan, because the tower is tall enough that a dropped brush is not a small event. It becomes a very fast lesson in why people invented rules. There's also the matter of wind. Wind at the top is not the same as wind on the street. Wind has layers. It has moods. It can be calm near the base and brisk higher up. It can change quickly. It can turn a simple task into an exercise in patience where you wait for the tower to stop behaving like a sail. If you're picturing painters calmly strolling around with buckets, the reality is more like careful climbing and slow work, and the constant awareness that the tower is open space. It is not a solid building. It is more like standing inside a skeleton. You can see through it, you can see down, you can see the city as a pattern. And if you are trying to sleep, you don't need to see down. You can simply imagine that the worker sees down, nods at it, and continues painting anyway, because this is their day. The tower also has an entire hidden life of small repairs. Rivets can loosen over time. Metal can fatigue. Connections can need reinforcement. The tower is monitored. It is measured. It is treated like a living structure, which sounds poetic, but is mostly technical. The tower expands and contracts with temperature. On hot days, it can be slightly taller by a measurable amount, which is charming because it implies the Eiffel Tower is a little more enthusiastic about summer. This expansion is not a secret, it's physics. But it's the kind of physics that feels mildly personal when applied to a beloved monument. Like the tower is stretching in the heat, the way a cat stretches in a sunbeam, except the cat is made of iron and is surrounded by people taking photos. And that brings us to another quietly amusing truth. The Eiffel Tower is constantly photographed, which means its paint job is constantly documented, whether anyone means to document it or not. There are decades of images where the tower is slightly different, slightly darker, slightly lighter, slightly more matte, slightly more glossy. The tower is a public object with a private maintenance history that leaks into everyone's memories as a subtle change in tone. If you want to drift into a particular boring corner of this topic, consider what it means to choose a paint color for the Eiffel Tower. Someone has to test it. Someone has to consider how it looks at noon and at dusk. Someone has to think about how it looks in fog, in rain, in the pale winter light. Someone has to think about how it looks in photographs, because modern life is partly a negotiation with cameras. The tower's color is not just a color. It's a decision about how the tower will appear to humans who are tired and squinting and trying to remember their trip. And because the tower is a symbol, the decision can become strangely emotional, which is ironic because the act of painting a tower is not emotional at all. It is repetitive. It is methodical. It is, in the best possible way, boring. The painter does not need to feel inspired. The painter needs to cover the metal. The painter needs to do it properly. The painter needs to not leave gaps. Gaps are where rust begins writing its own story. Rust, by the way, does not appear all at once. It begins quietly, a tiny breach, a scratch, a spot where water sat, a little orange stain. It looks small enough to ignore. And if ignored, it grows in a slow, stubborn way. Rust expands as it forms, which means it can push paint away, making the breach larger. It's like the tower has a tiny argument with chemistry, and chemistry is very patient. This is why maintenance is so relentless. Because if you want a structure to last, you don't wait for it to look broken. You treat it as something that will break if neglected. There's a gentle wisdom in that. The tower is basically an enormous lesson in preventative care, and Paris has been learning it for more than a century. Of course, Paris is shorthand. It's not as if the entire city gathers and agrees to repaint. It's organizations, contracts, specialists. It's engineers and planners. It's people who know how to calculate loads and corrosion rates and how long a coating will last in a given environment. It's also inevitably money. Paint is not free. Labor is not free. Scaffolding is not free. Keeping a tower from rusting is an ongoing subscription plan you can't cancel without consequences. And because this is the kind of history that is charmingly irrelevant, you can let your mind wander to the small sensory details. The smell of paint. The smell of metal warmed by sun. The sound of a brush on iron, which is probably a soft, dry whisper. The faint clink of a tool. The rhythmic tapping of rigging. If we borrow that sound from ships for a moment, because both ships and towers are large engineered objects that live in weather and require human care. You can also imagine the tower at night, when the city quiets down a little, and the tower is simply there, holding itself up. The paint doesn't sleep. The paint just exists. The iron continues being iron. The air continues being air. And somewhere in a quiet office, a file exists that says, in very unromantic language, when the next repainting must happen. The file does not say, we must preserve the symbol of Paris. The file says something like, coating renewal scheduled. It might include quantities. It might include dates. It might include safety requirements. It might include the number of layers, the types of solvents, the acceptable humidity for application. It might include a note about weather delays, because weather loves to delay paint. And if you're still awake, you might appreciate that weather delay is one of the most human phrases ever invented. It means we are trying to control the world, and the world is politely declining. You can't paint in heavy rain. You can't paint in certain winds. You can't paint if the surface is too wet. The tower will wait. The tower has time. Rust also has time, but that's why everyone is trying to stay one step ahead. Sometimes people talk about monuments as if they are eternal, but the Eiffel Tower is not eternal. It is maintained. It is preserved. It is loved through labor. And there's something quietly comforting in that, because it means lasting things last because someone shows up again and again to do the same unglamorous work. There is also something faintly funny about the idea that tourists often come to feel romance in Paris, and then stand under a tower that is, in part, a triumph of industrial maintenance. A tower is romantic because it exists. It exists because it is painted. If you ever needed proof that romance depends on boring things, the Eiffel Tower is doing its best to provide it with a straight face. And then, because this is bedtime history, we can let the tower drift in your imagination. Not physically drift, because it is very attached to the ground, but drift in the way an image drifts when you stop trying to hold it tightly. Picture the lattice against a dim sky. Picture the slow glow of the city below. Picture the wind moving through the structure, making it hum in tiny ways. Somewhere on the tower, if we imagine it in a year when repainting is underway, a worker is still there, quietly applying protection, not for glory, not for applause, just for the next 7 years. Just for the next layer of time, the brush moves, the paint settles. The metal disappears beneath a thin, even coat. It's repetitive, it's calm. It's the kind of work that becomes almost meditative if you do it long enough. And if you listen closely in the way you listen when you're trying to fall asleep, you can almost hear the softness of that repetition. Brush, pause, brush, step, check, brush. Tiny rhythm that has nothing to do with drama and everything to do with continuation. The tower stands, the paint dries, the night keeps its quiet, and the world's most famous maintenance schedule remains upright, brown, and politely protected for a little while longer, as if it could keep going forever, as if it could keep being cared for without anyone needing to announce it, as if the gentle work could go on in the background, fading into the kind of silence that doesn't end the story but simply lets it drift. You might not expect the history of sleep to depend, in part, on the management of wax, but it does. Not the dramatic kind of wax, either. Not the candle in a storm. Just the ordinary, slightly patient wax that sits on a shelf and waits to be turned into a quiet, dependable little pillar of light. And in the medieval world, especially inside monasteries, light was not a mood. Light was a budget line. Light was inventory. Light was something you counted because if you didn't count it, winter would count it for you. So let's begin gently with the smallest sound, a wick being trimmed. A soft snip, like someone cutting a thread that was never under tension in the first place. And if you're listening somewhere warm or somewhere cold, or somewhere that refuses to decide, Tell me in a whisper, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Because tonight we're not chasing a plot. We're drifting through a kind of cozy arithmetic, how monks quietly and repeatedly kept track of candles. A monastery after sundown is an environment designed for low drama. Stone holds the day's coolness. Footsteps soften on worn floors. A corridor becomes a corridor in a more serious way once the light changes. And somewhere, usually in a place that smells faintly of beeswax and linen and old wood, there's a person whose job is not prayer exactly, but the support of prayer. The person who minds the candles. The person who knows, down to the stub, what is left. In many communities, nothing important happened without a small record of it. Monasteries kept accounts. They tracked grain, cheese, wine, and the less romantic necessities like soap and nails and parchment. Wax belonged in that same calm category. Wax was a material that could disappear without anyone noticing, burned away into air, so it required a special kind of attention. A candle gives you this strange illusion that you are using something, but not losing anything. It looks steady. It stands there. It behaves. And then, a few hours later, it is simply shorter, like a polite magic trick performed for no applause. This is where the mild absurdity begins, because you can't preserve a candle by staring at it. The monastery needed light at fixed times, before dawn for early prayers, after dusk for reading, sometimes for copying manuscripts, sometimes for moving through buildings without walking directly into furniture. Darkness was not evil, exactly, but it was inconvenient, and inconvenience is one of history's most reliable motivators. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, but honestly, don't strain yourself. The medieval candle keepers didn't strain themselves either. They just kept counting. Now, there were different kinds of candles, and this matters in the soothingly technical way that makes a mind drift. Beeswax candles were the luxury option. They burned cleaner, they smelled better, and they produced less smoke. They were also expensive because bees do not mass-produce wax in a way that respects your schedule. Bees have their own priorities. Wax is something they make because they are being bees, not because a monk wants to finish copying a sermon before his hand cramps. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were cheaper and more common in many places. They also smelled more alive. They could smoke, they could drip. They could remind you, gently and persistently, that this light came from an animal. Tallow is practical in the way that winter coats are practical. Useful, not poetic, and occasionally a little too honest. So a monastery might reserve beeswax for the church where cleanliness and symbolism mattered, and use tallow for corridors, kitchens, and places where nobody's spiritual experience depended on the scent. Even that choice contains a quiet joke. The holiest spaces get the nicer smelling candles. The hallway gets the candle that smells like yesterday's stew. And of course, candles weren't just about visibility. They were also about time. A candle burning down can become a simple timer, especially when you live in a world where time is often measured by bells, routines, and the slow, steady movement of habit. You can imagine a monk noticing a candle has reached a certain point and thinking, with calm certainty, that it must be near the hour for something. Not because the candle is a clock, but because the candle is a companion to the schedule. If you want a tiny micro-hook to hold on to as you drift, it's this. Monasteries often had designated roles for extremely specific tasks. The candle person might be called a sacristan in some contexts, or a cellarer might oversee supplies more broadly. Different houses had different arrangements, but the concept stays. Someone is responsible for light. Someone is responsible for making sure the community doesn't accidentally spend the entire winter reading by moonlight because they felt like there were plenty of candles somewhere. And candles required materials beyond wax or fat. They required wicks. Wicks might be made from flax or linen, twisted into cords. The wick is the quiet hero of candle history. Wax gets the glory because it looks like the candle, but the wick is the one doing the work, pulling melted fuel upward like a tiny, continuous delivery system. If the wick is wrong, too thick, too thin, not properly prepared, the candle behaves badly. It smokes, it gutters, it wastes fuel, it becomes, in a sense, a bad employee. So monks, or the lay workers connected to a monastery, might dip wicks repeatedly into melted wax to build up layers. Dip, cool, dip, cool, dip. It's repetitive enough to feel like a prayer that doesn't require words. And it's also the kind of work where you can think about nothing at all, which is a luxury in any century. Now imagine the storeroom. Shelves, bundles, perhaps a chest, candles stacked like pale little promises. Some thick, some thin, some reserved, some ordinary. Someone records what comes in wax from the monastery's own hives, or purchased from outside, or received as part of rents and dues, because, yes, sometimes people paid obligations in wax. History is full of payments that feel like gifts until you remember they were required, and then the candles go out into the building, into the hours. Some are issued for the choir, some for the scriptorium, some for the infirmary, where light is gentle and necessary, some for guests, because monasteries hosted travelers, and even a traveler trying to be humble prefers not to sleep in total darkness beside unfamiliar shadows and the soft, judgmental presence of architecture. Here the counting becomes particularly tender, because once a candle is used, it becomes a stub. A stub is a small embarrassment for a candle, but also an opportunity. Wax stubs can be collected, melted down, and made into new candles. Nothing is wasted if you have patience in a pot, and medieval life was, above all, a lesson in patience. So someone gathers drippings. Someone scrapes wax from holders. Someone saves the ends. Imagine a basket of candle stubs, like a bouquet of tired little leftovers. It's almost sweet. It's also very practical. Wax is too valuable to throw away just because it's misshapen. And candle holders themselves are their own quiet world. Some are simple iron spikes, some are wooden. Some are more ornate and richer houses. Some hang, some sit. All of them exist to manage one perpetual problem. Wax wants to drip. Wax is loyal to gravity. And gravity, as always, is not interested in your furniture. If you want another small historical absurdity, consider the tool called a candle snuffer. It's a small cone on a handle designed to extinguish a flame without blowing, because blowing can scatter embers or send smoke in an unhelpful direction. Also, blowing feels a little casual for a holy space. The snuffer is a polite way to end a candle's work. It's like giving the flame a tiny hat and letting it retire. Now we shift slowly into the second half of our quiet tower of details, what candles meant socially inside a monastery. Because even in communities that aim for humility, resources create hierarchy, not the loud kind, the subtle kind. The kind you can feel in who gets a warmer cloak, who gets a better pen, who gets a candle close enough to read without leaning forward like a question mark. A scribe in a scriptorium copying texts needed steady light, but steady light costs wax. Wax costs money or labor or bees. So scribes might work in daylight when possible because daylight is conveniently free, but daylight also fades. And winter daylight is a short, slightly stingy thing. So perhaps candles appear more in certain seasons, and the storeroom manager feels the year as a pattern of depletion. You can imagine, without any drama, a small internal negotiation. How many candles can we spare tonight? How many for the reading desk? How many for the corridor? Do we light every passage? Or do we accept that some areas remain shadowy and require slow walking and familiarity with your surroundings? Monks were very familiar with their surroundings. They had to be. The walls didn't move, but your toes did. And then there are the rules. Some monastic rules included guidance on behavior after dark, silence, order, no wandering around without reason. Not because darkness is sinful, but because darkness plus wandering equals accidents, and accidents are distracting. It's hard to contemplate the divine while nursing a bruised shin. In some places, there were designated night lights, small lamps or candles kept in specific locations, like near staircases or key corridors. These weren't dramatic flames. They were small, dependable points, more suggestion than spotlight. It's a comforting concept, honestly. One small light, just enough to keep the building from becoming completely unknown. If you've ever left a hallway light on at night, not because you're afraid, but because you simply don't want to crash into a chair if you wake up, you already understand medieval lighting logic. It's the same human brain, just with fewer light switches and more wax. Another micro hook, beeswax was not only used for candles. It was used for seals, for waterproofing, for certain crafts. So wax had competition. A monastery might need wax to seal documents, letters, contracts, records. Seals mattered. They were authenticity in physical form. Wax was, in that sense, a security feature. A candle and a document could be fighting over the same lump of beeswax, quietly, across the table of history. And because we're drifting, we can let that thought sit. Wax is light and proof. Wax is both prayer and paperwork. Wax is both atmosphere and administration. The medieval world did not separate those things as neatly as we pretend to. Now imagine the candle inventory itself, the written record. It might not read like a story. It might read like a list of quantities, but we are not listing tonight. We are listening. We are letting the idea of record keeping become a soft rhythm. So many pounds of wax received. So many candles made. So many issued. So many steps collected. It's the heartbeat of maintenance. And maintenance is one of history's most soothing genres. Nothing happens, and yet everything continues. We move gently into a third set of scenes, the outer world touching the monastery through candles, because monasteries were not sealed bubbles. They had tenants, markets, visitors, and relationships with towns. They might purchase wax from beekeepers. They might trade. They might receive gifts. A wealthy patron could donate beeswax candles as a pious act, which is a quietly funny kind of generosity. Here, I have given you light. It's both practical and symbolic, like donating batteries to a church. On feast days, candles mattered more. The church would be brighter. The rituals would be more illuminated. An illumination in a stone building is not small. Light changes how space feels. It changes how music sounds. It changes faces. A candle at service is not just a service, it's an environment. So you can see why beeswax would be preferred when the monastery wanted the air to smell sweet and the light to feel clean. Candlemas, the feast in early February, is famously connected to candles, the blessing of candles for the year. The timing makes sense. February is a month that feels like it needs reassurance. Winter is still present. The days are technically longer, but not in a way that comforts you. Blessing candles is a religious act, yes, but it's also a calm acknowledgement of a practical truth. We will need light. We will need it repeatedly. We will need it even when we are tired of needing it. And here's a tiny, sleepy irony. The more you need candles, the more you must spend time making and managing them, which takes time you could have spent in contemplation. The medieval life was full of these loops. You pray about simplicity while organizing supplies. You seek quiet while maintaining the tools that make quiet possible. Sometimes monasteries kept bees. Not always, but often enough that the image feels plausible and peaceful. Skeps or hives, a small hum near an orchard, someone checking them carefully, respecting the bee's temper. Bees are not impressed by holiness. Bees are impressed by calm movements and not standing in front of the entrance like a confused bear. And even if a monastery didn't keep bees, it relied on someone who did. The economy of wax was part of rural life. Wax moved through hands. It became candles. It became seals. It became something that disappeared one flame at a time. Now, if your mind wants a gentle modern analogy, consider the way people feel about phone batteries. You think you have plenty. Then you use them. Then you realize you should have charged earlier. Then you become aware, suddenly and personally, of consumption. Medieval candle inventory is like living with a phone you can only charge by slowly dipping it in melted wax. You would become very respectful of turning lights on unnecessarily. And in the same way people have opinions about brightness settings, monasteries likely had habits around when to light and when to endure dimness. Some people tolerate gloom better. Some want a candle for everything. There is always, in any community, at least one person who would light an extra candle if nobody stopped them, and at least one person who would rather walk in darkness than spend wax. Human types are stable across centuries. Only the accessories change. We come now to the quiet consequences. What happens after a candle is used, after wax is melted, after stubs are saved? The monastery lives forward. The record continues. That there are also small sensory leftovers, sit on walls, smoke in rafters, the faint smell of tallow lingering in a corridor, the tiny marks of drips hardened on stone. These are the kinds of details that don't make it into heroic history books, but they are the texture of actual life. If you've ever noticed that a room looks different after you've burned a candle in it, warmer, softer, slightly older, then you understand how monasteries accumulated atmosphere, not through intention, but through repetition. Centuries of light, quietly leaving a trace. Somewhere, perhaps, a monk complains in a mild way, not loudly, not dramatically about smoke, or about the smell of cheap candles, or about drafts that make flames flicker and gutter. Drafts are the quiet enemies of candlelight. A steady flame is pleasant. A flame that keeps being pushed around by a corridor's personality is less pleasant. So monasteries learned where to place lights. They learned where the air moved. They learned by living there the building's habits. And over time, the tower becomes known not just as a landmark, but as a set of predictable problems. Wax drips here. Wind is strong there. The stairs are treacherous in the dark. This corridor needs a light because someone once tripped and nobody wants a repeat performance. Its history as a collection of tiny policies. Even the act of extinguishing candles is its own nightly ritual. Someone makes rounds. Someone snuffs lights in the right order. Not because it's dramatic, but because leaving candles burning unattended is risky. Fire is useful and also extremely committed to being fire. A monastery built partly of wood roof beams, furnishings, stored materials does not benefit from accidental enthusiasm. So night after night, there is a pattern. Light appears, does its quiet service, and disappears. The building returns to shadow. The community returns to sleep. And in the storeroom, what remains is counted again, because tomorrow is another day with another dusk. Now let's end in the softest way possible without wrapping anything up like a show. Imagine the last candle of the evening in a small corner, perhaps a reading desk, perhaps a corridor light burning down to a modest stub. The flame is small. It doesn't perform. It simply exists, making a small circle of visibility in a world that is otherwise content with darkness. Someone comes. There is the gentle cone of the snuffer. The flame vanishes without protest. The wick cools. The room becomes quietly larger in the dark, as if walls extend when they are no longer being watched. The stub is saved, not as a keepsake, just as material, wax returning to wax, light returning to inventory. A note might be made, or maybe it's only remembered. Either way, the rhythm continues. Dip, trim, burn, snuff, collect, melt, repeat. And if you listen long enough, that repetition becomes almost like breathing slow, steady, unnecessary to think about. The monastery sleeps. The candle room smells faintly sweet or faintly smoky, depending on what was used. The accounts wait. The bees somewhere are quietly being bees, and the night holds its darkness without urgency, as if it could go on forever, while the next small candle, somewhere on a shelf, waits patiently to become time. There's a particular kind of silence that happens after the sea is done being theatrical. Not the silence of fog or the silence of a calm deck, but the silence of paperwork arriving. A ship can drift for days without anyone speaking to it, and then quite suddenly it becomes the subject of people speaking very clearly, with ink in rooms that smell like wood and old coats. And that's one of the stranger transitions in maritime history. The moment an empty vessel stops being an ocean problem and becomes a legal object, like a chair that needs a receipt. If you're listening from somewhere quiet, you can keep it quiet. If there's a fan humming, let it hum. And if you're still awake a little later, you can subscribe if you want. Or don't. The Mary Celeste won't mind either way. It has already shown a strong ability to continue without anyone's input. Once an abandoned ship is found, the ocean doesn't really care what happens next. The ocean is famously uninterested in ownership, but humans are extremely interested in ownership, especially when the ownership is damp, valuable, and inconveniently floating. So the first question becomes something that sounds simple and then becomes less simple the moment you try to say it out loud. Who gets to claim an empty ship? The sea has a habit of producing situations that feel like riddles written by someone who has never had to fill out a form. You spot a vessel with sails set, drifting as if it has an appointment, and you realize nobody is answering. You bored. You find it tidy in the wrong way, like a house where the dishes are done but the family has vanished. And then after the initial feeling of this is unsettling comes the calmer feeling of this is expensive, because a ship is not just wood. It is cargo. It is equipment. It is future profit that has somehow paused itself and now waits to be assigned to the correct person by a judge who probably slept indoors. So the Mary Celeste gets taken in tow, which is a phrase that sounds gentle until you imagine the actual mechanics of it. Ropes, tension, the patient strain of one vessel pulling another, a slow procession across water, and even that towing has a kind of sleepy irony. The abandoned ship is still traveling, still moving, still behaving like a ship, even though its purpose has been removed. It's like a clock that keeps ticking after everyone has left the house. Eventually, you arrive at a port, and the story begins to dry out. Not completely, because nothing maritime ever truly dries out, but enough that people can sit down and argue without slipping. At this stage, the Mary Celeste becomes less of a mystery and more of a case, and cases have habits. Cases want names, dates, inventories, testimony, and an orderly explanation for who did what, and why they should be rewarded or blamed. The sea does not supply orderly explanations. It supplies soaked facts and the occasional loose object. This is where salvage law enters, and salvage law is one of the most boring, most necessary romances humans have ever invented. The basic idea is simple. If you save a vessel or cargo from danger, you deserve compensation. Not because you are morally pure, but because the law would like you to keep doing helpful things instead of watching valuable property sink out of spite. Salvage is the legal system's way of saying very calmly, please don't be lazy during disasters. There are categories and terms that sound like they belong in a quiet board game. Derelict is one of them. A derelict ship, in a legal sense, isn't just a creepy ship. It's a ship that appears to have been abandoned without hope of return. The word has a slightly haunted feeling in modern English, but in a courtroom it becomes oddly practical, like labeling a jar. And once the label is applied, the arguments begin. Was it truly abandoned, or merely left temporarily? Was it in peril? Was it saved? Was the saving heroic, or merely opportunistic, or, my favorite possibility, moderately competent? This is the part where the Mary Celeste becomes a list. Not in a bullet point way, but in the deeper human way. People begin naming what was on board. What was missing, what was damaged, what was fine. Inventories are a kind of lullaby if you read them slowly enough. They're repetitive. They're cautious. They are full of small nouns that carry no suspense at all. Barrels, ropes, instruments, sails, food stores, personal belongings, cargo, the ship itself, described in pieces and measurements, like a body being politely introduced to a new doctor. And then the cargo becomes its own small character, because cargo is where money tends to hide. Barrels of industrial alcohol, for example, are not romantic, but they are valuable. They are also the kind of cargo that invites very specific questions, like whether fumes could build up, or whether a barrel could leak, or whether a captain might behave differently when the ship smells faintly like a chemistry experiment. It's not exciting. It is just the kind of detail that makes you squint at the world and realize history often hinges on storage conditions. In the courtroom, people try to turn the ship into something readable. Witnesses describe what they saw, and because humans are humans, what they saw becomes slightly different depending on where they stood and what they expected. One person remembers the state of the cabin. Another remembers the angle of a sail. Someone remembers whether a chest looked disturbed. Someone remembers whether the galley seemed recently used. And it all gets compressed into language, which is always slightly smaller than reality, like trying to fit the ocean into a cup. There is also a faintly awkward question hovering over every salvage case. Are the salvors entirely honest? Not because sailors are uniquely dishonest, but because the universe has created a situation where you can profit from someone else's misfortune, and the law must not pretend it can measure your sincerity with paperwork. So courts examine motives, they examine behavior, they examine whether anything was stolen, whether anything was altered, whether the salvors did more harm than good while helping, and the Mary Celeste, in particular, invites suspicion simply because it is so neat. A ship found in ruins would be easy to accept. A ship found politely intact makes everyone's imagination wake up and start pacing. So the legal conversation becomes a gentle tug-of-war between two desires. The desire to treat this as ordinary salvage, and the desire to treat it as a suspicious event that must have an explanation with a culprit, or at least a satisfying shape. But history is often shaped like a room after guests leave. You can tell people were there, but you cannot reconstruct every conversation from the placement of cups. The courtroom does not like that. The courtroom prefers cups that confess. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the story develops another life, newspapers, public chatter, retellings. The Mary Celeste becomes a kind of floating prompt for human curiosity. An empty ship is a perfect object for storytelling because it refuses to correct you. It never interrupts. It never says, actually, that's not what happened. It simply sits there, mute and durable, and allows each era to project its favorite fears onto it. And newspapers, like waves, enjoy repetition. A detail is printed, it is repeated. It becomes calmly known. Another detail is added, sometimes by accident, sometimes by convenience. The ship grows slightly more dramatic each time it is described, because drama sells better than the cargo was mostly intact and the furniture stayed put. If you've ever noticed how a quiet event on the internet becomes louder after a few rounds of retelling, you've already experienced the Mary Celeste effect in miniature. This is where the business of wonder begins. Wonder can be monetized. It can be printed. It can be performed. A mystery that never resolves can be resold indefinitely because the lack of an ending is, strangely, a kind of renewable resource. With each retelling, the ship becomes less like a real brigantine and more like a symbol, an emblem of the sea's ability to keep secrets. Even when the sea is actually just busy being large. But even as the myth grows, the paperwork remains. And the paperwork is the sleepy anchor. While people imagine pirates or monsters or hidden plots, the court documents ask quieter questions. How much is the vessel worth? How much is the cargo worth? How much effort did the salvors expend? How dangerous was it? How should the reward be calculated? This is the part where history becomes arithmetic again, like candle budgets, like grain accounts. The world returns to its favorite method of staying calm: numbers. A salvage award is not a moral judgment as much as it is a calculation wearing a wig. It recognizes risk and labor. It tries, imperfectly, to discourage greed while still encouraging action. It is the law's attempt to turn maritime chaos into a polite transaction. And if you listen carefully, the whole thing is almost soothing. A ship that was once alone on the ocean is now surrounded by order. Clerks, hearings, testimony, receipts, valuations. The sea is replaced by the steady sound of writing. The ship's silence is translated into official language, which is its own kind of quiet. Of course, there's still a lingering discomfort beneath the ink. Not because anyone is screaming in court, but because nobody can produce the one thing a human mind wants most: the simple story. The clear moment where someone says, "Here's why the lifeboat left," and everyone nods and goes home. Instead, you get a collection of plausible explanations, none of which feel complete. And the court, which can decide who gets paid, cannot decide what truly happened out there because it was not there. The court has authority over ownership, not over the past. So the Mary Celeste becomes a split object. In law, it is a vessel with a claim attached. In public imagination, it is an unanswered question. Those two identities coexist like two labels on the same crate. One label says property, the other says mystery, and humans have always had trouble deciding which label they prefer. Even the ship's very ordinariness becomes part of its fascination. It was not a legendary vessel when it left port. It did not have a dramatic name like Doom of the West or Serpent's Bride. It was a working ship doing a working job. It was transporting a cargo that was useful, not glamorous. And that's what makes its later fame feel oddly unfair, as if it didn't ask to become a story. And yet stories are often assigned the way salvage awards are assigned, by whoever arrives first and speaks the loudest. If your mind needs one more micro hook to drift on, let it be this. A mystery doesn't always begin with a scream. Sometimes it begins with a normal ship doing normal shipping, and then a small chain of decisions and conditions: weather, fumes, fear, miscalculation, time rearranges everything. History loves that kind of quiet vulnerability. It reminds you that the world is held together by routines, and routines can slip. And now, as we ease toward the end of this section, imagine the ship no longer under sail, no longer gliding like a ghost, but resting, claimed, discussed, transformed into a sentence. Not a poetic sentence, more like a legal one. A set of names and numbers and careful phrases. A kind of sentence that tries to be final and cannot quite manage it. The ocean keeps moving outside, indifferent. The port keeps smelling like salt and rope and the faint complaint of tar. Inside, papers are stacked, ink dries. Someone seals a document with wax quietly, almost tenderly, because even mysteries need filing. And somewhere in the background of all of this, the Mary Celeste remains what it has always been: wood and canvas and iron, a human-made thing that did not come with an explanation attached. The arguments soften. The voices lower. The story drifts away from the courtroom and back into the sleepy space where questions can exist without answers. The lantern light in the office dims. The last clerk closes a ledger. The page makes that soft sound paper makes when it accepts being shut. And outside, the water continues its old, unhurried practice of moving and moving, as if it could do this forever, without ever needing to explain itself. You might not expect a ghost ship as Second Life to begin with a clerk clearing his throat, but it often does. After the sea has finished being vague and salty and uncooperative, the story tends to shuffle indoors into rooms that smell like paper damp wool and the stubborn optimism of people who believe everything can be sorted if you number it. So let's imagine the Mary Celeste not as a drifting riddle for a moment, but as something far less glamorous. A file, a case, a bundle of statements, a vessel that has been reduced gently, politely to handwriting. This is where the mystery grows quieter, not louder. The ocean is loud when it wants to be. Paper is loud only if you crumple it, and even then it apologizes. If you're listening from bed, keep your shoulders heavy. If you're listening from a chair, let the chair do the work. And if you're still awake long enough to hear me say this, you can subscribe. Or don't. The Mary Celeste famously ran without an audience, and there's something almost inspiring about that level of independence. Once the abandoned ship is brought to port, everyone stops speaking in waves and starts speaking in categories. The question becomes less what happened out there and more, what is this worth, and who is allowed to touch it? Which sounds cold, but it's the kind of cold that keeps societies from turning into constant bartering arguments. The ship has to be claimed, assessed, and treated like property again, even if it still feels like a question mark with rigging. This is where salvage enters with its calm, mildly judgmental logic. Salvage is one of those systems that sounds like it was invented by someone who got tired of watching people ignore emergencies. The idea is simple. If you save something at sea ship, cargo, anything that would otherwise be lost, you can receive a reward. Not because you're a saint, but because the law is trying to encourage helpful behavior in a world where helpful behavior is inconvenient and frequently wet. And then you get the vocabulary, which is strangely soothing if you let it wash over you. Derelict, award, claim, admiralty. Words that feel like they belong to a quiet museum corridor. A derelict vessel isn't just eerie. It's legally unaccompanied. It's a ship that has lost its human layer, and the law has to decide whether that layer is truly gone or merely temporarily elsewhere for reasons that will not be explained in a way that satisfies anyone. So people begin listing what was found. This is one of the most sleep-friendly activities humanity has ever invented, making lists of objects that exist. The ship contains ropes. The ship contains barrels. The ship contains navigation instruments that were designed with sincere seriousness to argue with the horizon. The ship contains bedding, utensils, clothing, the quiet residue of ordinary life that is only remarkable because it is still there. And then the cargo becomes its own little subplot, except we're not doing plots tonight, so we'll call it a topic that refuses to go away, because cargo is where money hides. The Mary Celeste carried industrial alcohol, and alcohol is one of those historical substances that is never just a substance. It is always a policy problem, a taxation problem, a storage problem, and occasionally a why does the room smell like a chemistry class problem. Barrels can leak, vapors can gather, people can become nervous for reasons that are technically invisible. Of course, the courtroom doesn't want technically invisible. The courtroom wants visible. It wants testimony. It wants a witness who can point to a moment and say, this happened, but the sea doesn't provide clean moments. It provides conditions. The closest it gets to explanation is weather. So the hearings, quiet, formal, patiently tedious circle around two things at once. First, the practical. How much should the salvors be paid for bringing the ship in? Second, the suspicious. Did anyone do something they shouldn't have done, either before the ship was found or after? Because here is the soft irony of salvage. It asks you to reward the people who arrive after disaster, while also wondering if those people might have been tempted to help the disaster along. Not because sailors are uniquely untrustworthy, but because humans are humans, and whenever you create a reward system, someone will stare at it the way a cat stares at a glass on a table and think very quietly, I wonder what happens if I push this. So the case becomes cautious. Were any items missing? Were any items disturbed? Did the salvors change the scene? Did they take anything as a souvenir, which is a polite word for theft when the object is small enough to fit in a pocket? It's the kind of investigation that can feel almost domestic. A ship is a house that moves. And now people are essentially arguing about whether someone rearranged the furniture. And this is where the Mary Celeste becomes doubly irritating in a very sleepy way because it refuses to be dramatic. There isn't enough damage. There isn't enough obvious violence. There isn't enough chaos. The ship is tidy in that unsettling, unhelpful manner. It's like opening a book and finding the bookmark still in place, even though the reader's gone. It's not an ending. It's an interruption. So lawyers and judges do what people always do when faced with interruption. They try to restore sequence. They ask about the captain. They ask about the crew. They ask about the lifeboat. They ask about the last known coordinates and the condition of the vessel when it was found. They ask about weather patterns like weather owes them an apology. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the solvers themselves have to sit with the strange experience of being both heroes and suspects. 1 minute, you're the person who prevented a valuable ship from drifting until it became a joke. The next minute, you're being asked whether you happened to prevent it in a way that benefited you a bit too neatly. It's an exhausting position, and not the kind of exhaustion that smells like salt air. This is the exhaustion of being looked at carefully. But even if the court can't solve the mystery, it can solve something else, the distribution of money. And there is a peculiar comfort in that. A judge can't summon the missing crew, but a judge can say, in a stable indoor voice, "This is the award. A number is given. A percentage is decided." The ship becomes, at least temporarily, a financial object instead of a metaphysical one. And because humans are wonderfully repetitive, the public does what it always does. It turns the whole event into something consumable. This is where newspapers arrive, and with them the gentle business of wonder. An empty ship is the perfect newspaper item because it is both simple and endlessly expandable. Simple, a vessel was found with no one aboard. Expandable, why, how, what if, did you hear, someone said, experts believe, a fisherman once saw. And this is where the story starts to gain decorations, because the first reports are usually plain. Plain is honest, but plain is not always profitable. So details get sharpened, exaggerated, or mistakenly repeated until they become tradition. A cup becomes a still warm meal, even if the ocean air makes warm food a difficult concept. A missing item becomes a sign of struggle, because missing items sounds like a shopping problem, and struggle sounds like a story. If you've ever watched a rumor grow online, you already understand how the Mary Celeste becomes more theatrical with time. Each retelling is like a small wave adding a little foam. Nobody intends to lie. They just intend to hold attention. And attention, unlike ships, does not like calm seas. So the Mary Celeste becomes less of a vessel and more of a container for imagination. It's almost unfair to the ship, honestly. It was not built to be a symbol. It was built to do the deeply unpoetic work of moving cargo. And yet, by being found empty, it becomes an object that people can project themselves into. Fear, fascination, suspicion, romance, dread, everything fits inside an unanswered question. And then come the theories, which are like lullabies for anxious minds. Theories are soothing because they offer shape. Pirates, mutiny, poison fumes, sudden panic, a misread storm, a practical decision that went wrong. The mind loves these because they feel like endings, even if they are only guesses wearing costumes. But the evidence stubbornly stays polite. It refuses to perform. It doesn't come with a villain. It doesn't come with a confession letter tucked under a pillow. It just sits there, quietly incomplete, like a sentence that ends mid-thought because the writer was called away. This is the strange thing about maritime mysteries. Sometimes the most realistic explanation is also the most boring. A crew might leave a ship temporarily because something felt dangerous fumes, Water, the fear of explosion, and then fail to return because distance and weather and rope and timing conspired in their usual, unromantic way. The sea doesn't need monsters. It only needs small errors and a large indifference. And still, humans keep telling the story, because telling the story is what we do when we can to bear the quiet shape of not knowing. Every generation retells it in its own language. In one era, it's pirates. In another, it's scientific mishap. In another, it's something stranger, because the era itself is strange. The Mary Celeste survives as a narrative because it never resolves. It keeps its silence like a professional. Now, if you let the tone soften further, you can see the afterlife of a mystery as something gentler than obsession. It's a kind of slow cultural rocking. The ship becomes a bedtime story for adults who like their mysteries low volume. It becomes a thought you can turn over without hurting yourself. There's no jump scare in the facts. The facts are steady. The facts are tired. And at the end of all these papers and headlines, we return to something simpler. A quiet deck at night with a lantern moving slightly, not because it wants to be spooky, but because the wind is still doing its job. Picture the Mary Celeste not as a headline, but as a space, wood underfoot. A mild creak that sounds like the ship clearing its throat. The rigging ticking with small, repetitive noises, tiny reminders that tension exists, even when nobody is speaking. The sea is gentle enough to make the hull feel like it's being tapped, softly, as if someone is politely checking whether the world is still there. Somewhere near the helm, the compass sits with that stubborn calm that compasses have. North. Always north. Even when the human plan dissolves, the little needle keeps its quiet opinion. It's almost funny, in the driest possible way. The instrument remains faithful to direction while the people are not present to benefit from it. The compass does not sulk. It does not panic. It just points. And if you drift through the ship slowly, you notice how many objects exist simply to support routine. A mug, a plate, a bit of rope coiled because someone once believed coiling mattered. A knife that was used for cutting ordinary things, not for drama. A logbook that wanted, desperately, to keep time in order. All these items are not haunted. They are merely unfinished. Like a room after someone steps out and forgets to come back. The idea that the scariest mysteries aren't loud is, honestly, a comfort. Loud things demand your attention. Quiet things let your attention relax. The Mary Celeste is a quiet mystery. It doesn't chase you. It doesn't demand belief. It just exists, and that's why it's lingered. Because it's tidy, plausible, and incomplete, like life. So hold that as you settle deeper. The ship is not an omen. It's a reminder that history is full of ordinary system ships, laws, newspapers, habits running smoothly, until one small missing piece makes the whole machine feel strange. And then, after the moment passes, the systems keep going. The ship is claimed. The papers are filed. The headlines fade. The ocean keeps moving, as if it has always been moving, and as if it always will. The lantern swings. The deck pulls. The wind eases into a softer rhythm, and the sails, if they're up at all, settle into stillness like fabric finally deciding to rest. Somewhere far away, a clerk closes a ledger with a gentle thump, satisfied that at least the numbers have been placed where they belong. And the Mary Celeste, whether a ship or story, drifts back into the kind of silence that doesn't explain itself, the kind of silence that doesn't need to, the kind that simply continues, patient and unhurried, like the sea breathing in the dark.